There is a hill beside a river in central Italy where, more than 2,500 years ago, a small collection of huts stood among sheep pens and cattle tracks. The river was the Tiber. The hill was one of 7 that would eventually be joined into a single city. Nothing about that early settlement suggested it would become the center of the largest and most durable empire the ancient world would ever produce. It was a modest place, built by farmers and herders who chose the location for practical reasons. The river provided fresh water and a route for trade. The surrounding hills offered defensible high ground, and the marshy lowland between them, later drained and paved, would one day be known as the Forum. Italy in the 8th century before the Common Era was a peninsula of scattered peoples, each with its own language, its own gods, and its own way of organizing daily life. To the north were the Etruscans, a sophisticated civilization with considerable skill in engineering, in the working of bronze and iron, and in the construction of elaborate tombs cut into hillsides and painted with scenes of banquets and dancing. Etruscan cities were often larger and more architecturally advanced than anything the early Latins could produce. And for a long stretch of Rome's early history, it was the Etruscans who set the pace of technological and artistic development in the region. To the south, along the coasts of Sicily and southern Italy, Greek settlers had been founding colonies for generations, bringing with them their alphabet, their pottery, their philosophy, and their particular style of city planning built around open civic spaces. In between these two more established cultures sat the Latins, a loose confederation of villages sharing a common language and, gradually, a common set of religious festivals. Rome was one of these Latin villages, sitting at a natural crossing point of the river, a position that gave it an early and lasting advantage. Anyone moving goods or armies north to south along the coast or east to west between the interior and the sea tended to pass through or near it. Trade brought wealth, and wealth brought the kind of population growth that, over generations, turns a handful of hilltop huts into something resembling a town. The Romans themselves, once they began writing their own history many centuries later, told a more dramatic story of their beginnings. They spoke of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who fled his city as it burned at the end of the Trojan War, and who, after long wanderings across the Mediterranean, eventually settled in Italy. From his line, they said, descended the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, sons of a princess, and, according to the legend, the god Mars himself. Abandoned as infants on the orders of a usurping relative who feared them as rivals, the twins were said to have been found and suckled by a she-wolf on the banks of the Tiber before being raised by a shepherd and his wife. When they came of age and learned of their true heritage, they decided to found a city on the site where they had been rescued. A dispute arose between them over precisely where the city's sacred boundary should run, and in the argument that followed, Romulus killed his brother. The city that resulted took his name, and its founding was traditionally dated to the year we now call 753 BCE. It is worth pausing on this story, not because it should be treated as literal history, but because of what it reveals about how the Romans understood themselves. They imagined their own beginnings as violent, contested, and shaped by rivalry between brothers who might otherwise have ruled together. That theme of internal conflict resolved through force rather than compromise would recur throughout Roman history in ways that were rather more consequential than a myth about twins and a wolf. What can be said with more confidence, based on the physical evidence left in the ground, rather than on stories passed down through generations of storytellers, is that the site of Rome was inhabited from at least the 10th century before the Common Era, and that by the 8th and 7th centuries, the scattered hilltop villages were consolidating into something more like a single town, with shared burial grounds, shared religious sites, and eventually a shared boundary wall. This process was neither instant nor especially deliberate. It happened the way early urbanization tends to happen almost everywhere, through gradual population growth, the slow merging of neighboring communities who found it more useful to cooperate than to compete, and the emergence of common institutions that could manage disputes over land, water, and grazing rights. The early Romans were governed in this formative period by kings. Roman tradition names 7 of them, beginning with Romulus and ending with a ruler called Tarquin the Proud, whose reign is said to have come to an end around 509 BCE. Some of these kings were very likely historical figures, even if the specific events attributed to their reigns have been reshaped and embellished by later generations of writers eager to explain the origins of Roman customs. Under their rule, the city expanded gradually, absorbed several neighboring settlements, and developed the core institutions that would remain central to Roman public life for the rest of its history. A senate of aristocratic elders, initially perhaps a few hundred heads of leading families, served as an advisory council to the king, offering counsel on matters of religion, warfare, and law. Religious colleges, staffed by priests drawn from the same aristocratic families, developed elaborate systems for interpreting omens and the will of the gods. Systems the Romans would consult before nearly every significant public decision, from declaring war to founding a new colony. And the population itself was organized into extended family groups called gentes, bound together by shared ancestry, shared religious rites, and mutual obligation. A structure that would continue to shape Roman social life for centuries after the kings themselves had been forgotten as anything other than characters in a founding legend. The end of the monarchy, according to the account later Roman historians settled on, came about because of an act of violence committed by the last king's son against a noblewoman named Lucretia, whose subsequent death by her own hand is said to have provoked an uprising led by a nobleman named Lucius Junius Brutus. Whatever the precise historical truth behind this story, and there is reason to think it compresses and dramatizes a longer and messier process, the outcome was real enough. By the end of the 6th century BCE, the Romans had expelled their royal family and abolished kingship as a form of government. In its place, they established something new: a republic, governed not by a single hereditary ruler, but by officials elected to serve limited terms. 2 consuls, chosen annually, held the executive authority that had once belonged to the king, and crucially, each consul possessed the power to veto the actions of the other, a deliberate check meant to prevent any single man from accumulating the kind of unchecked authority the Romans now associated, whether fairly or not, with tyranny. This new system was not a democracy in any modern sense. Political power in the young republic remained concentrated almost entirely in the hands of a hereditary aristocracy known as the patricians, a small number of families who alone could hold the highest offices of state and serve as priests in the most important religious colleges. The much larger population of ordinary citizens, called plebeians, held far more limited rights. Unable at first even to marry into patrician families, or to have their grievances heard through any formal channel. A great deal of early Republican history, in fact, is the story of a long and gradual struggle between these two groups, a conflict historians now refer to, somewhat dryly, as the conflict of the orders. It unfolded not in a single dramatic revolution, but across roughly 2 centuries, through a slow accumulation of concessions won by one side from the other. And it is worth understanding in some detail because it shaped the peculiar and resilient structure of Roman government for the rest of the Republic's existence. The plebeians, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population and the overwhelming majority of the army that defended the city, discovered early on that they possessed a form of leverage. The patricians could not easily ignore. They could simply withdraw their cooperation. On at least 5 separate occasions during the early Republic, when plebeian grievances went unaddressed for too long, large numbers of plebeians left the city altogether, gathering instead on a nearby hill, refusing to work, to trade, or to serve in the military until their demands were met. These withdrawals, known to historians as secessions, proved remarkably effective, precisely because a city and an army without its plebeian majority could not function at all. Rome's fields would go unharvested, its markets would sit empty, and its legions would have no soldiers to fill their ranks. Through this pressure, applied patiently over generations, plebeians gradually won a series of significant concessions. They secured the right to elect their own officials, called tribunes, who held the power to veto any action taken by patrician magistrates that harmed plebeian interests, and whose persons were considered sacred and inviolable under Roman religious law. They won the codification of Roman law into a single written text, the 12 Tables, posted publicly in the Forum around 450 BCE, so that laws could no longer be interpreted arbitrarily and often self-servingly by patrician judges behind closed doors. Over time, they won the right to intermarry freely with patrician families, breaking down one of the most rigid barriers between the two orders. And eventually, by 287 BCE, with the passage of a law called the Lex Hortensia, they won the principle that resolutions passed by their own popular assembly would carry the full force of law, binding on patricians and plebeians alike, without requiring separate approval from the Senate. The significance of this long internal struggle is easy to overlook amid the more famous military conquests that followed it. But it deserves real attention, because it explains something that might otherwise seem mysterious: how a relatively small city-state managed, again and again, to absorb serious internal tension without descending into the kind of civil collapse that ended so many other ancient states. By the time Rome began its rapid territorial expansion across the Italian peninsula in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, it had already developed a political culture that, however dominated in practice by wealthy and well-connected families, had built into it functioning mechanisms for managing conflict between different segments of society. This resilience, forged slowly and sometimes painfully over 2 centuries of internal negotiation, would matter enormously as Rome's ambitions and its problems grew larger than anyone in that early republic could have imagined. Rome's expansion within Italy proceeded not through any single grand campaign, but through a long, uneven series of wars fought against a rotating cast of neighboring peoples, the Etruscans to the north, whose once dominant cities gradually fell one by one under Roman pressure, the Samnites, a tough and mountainous people of the Central Highlands, against whom Rome fought 3 separate wars spanning nearly half a century, various other Latin communities, some of which had once been Rome's equals and allies before being absorbed or subordinated, and Greek cities in the far south of the peninsula, whose sophisticated culture and formidable mercenary armies posed one of the last serious obstacles to Roman control of Italy. These campaigns were not the product of any grand strategic vision drawn up in advance by a Roman government thinking in terms of empire. They emerged, war by war, from immediate disputes over land, over alliances, over the safety of Roman citizens and allies, and from the internal logic of a society whose aristocracy measured personal status largely through demonstrated military achievement. A young Roman noble seeking political advancement needed to prove his courage and competence in combat, and the Senate, itself composed of that same military aristocracy, had every incentive to keep finding conflicts in which such proof could be offered. Expansion, in other words, was not merely a policy. It was, in some sense, built into the social structure of the Republic itself. By 275 BCE, after a hard-fought and costly victory over a coalition led by the Greek king Pyrrhus of Epirus, who won several tactically impressive battles against Roman forces, but could never translate those victories into a lasting strategic advantage, and who is remembered today chiefly through the phrase Pyrrhic victory, describing a triumph that costs more than it is worth. Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River Valley. This was no small achievement. It had taken more than 2 centuries of intermittent warfare, and it had required Rome to develop something its rivals often lacked: a durable and reasonably generous system for incorporating defeated peoples, offering many of them Roman citizenship, partial citizenship, or formal alliance rather than simple subjugation, which meant that conquered Italian communities often had a genuine stake in Rome's continued success rather than a burning desire to see it destroyed. This system of incorporation, more than any single military tactic or weapon, may have been Rome's single greatest advantage over the centuries that followed, allowing it to draw on a much deeper pool of manpower than any of its rivals could match. It is worth pausing here to look more closely at the instrument that made this long process of conquest and incorporation possible in the first place: the Roman legion itself. An institution that would evolve considerably over the coming centuries, but whose basic logic was already taking shape during these Italian wars. In this earlier Republican period, the legion was not yet the standing professional force it would later become under Augustus. It was instead raised anew in principle for each year's campaigning season, from citizens who met a minimum property qualification and who were expected to supply a significant portion of their own equipment, a system that effectively tied military service to a stake in the wider economic and political life of the Republic. A legion in this era numbered somewhere in the range of 4,000 to 5,000 men, organized not as a single undifferentiated mass, but into smaller tactical units, initially arranged by the wealth and equipment each soldier could afford, with the poorer citizens serving as lightly armed skirmishers at the front and the wealthier, more heavily armored citizens forming the more decisive lines behind them. Over the course of the 4th century BCE, in the wars against the Samnites in particular, this rigid arrangement gave way to a more flexible system, organized around smaller units called maniples, each containing on the order of 120 men, arranged in a checkerboard pattern across the battlefield that allowed individual units to advance, retreat, or be relieved by fresh troops behind them without the entire battle line collapsing into disorder. a considerable tactical advantage against enemies who fought in more rigid, unbroken formations. Standard equipment for the Roman infantrymen of this period centered on a large, curved rectangular shield, a short thrusting sword eventually adopted from Spanish designs and known as the gladius, a pair of javelins called pila, designed to be thrown just before contact with the enemy line, and a bronze helmet, along with whatever body armor the individual soldier could afford, ranging from a simple chest plate for poorer citizens to more complete mail or plate protection for the wealthy. Discipline within the legion was famously severe, enforced through a system of rewards for valor and harsh, sometimes brutal punishments for failure, including, in cases of serious collective cowardice or mutiny, a punishment called decimation, in which 1 in every 10 men in the offending unit was selected by lot and beaten to death by his own comrades. A practice invoked only rarely across Roman history, but one that reflects how seriously Roman commanders treated the maintenance of order within the ranks. This combination of flexible tactical organization, standardized equipment, and unforgiving discipline, refined gradually across the Samnite Wars and the wars against Pyrrhus, gave Rome a military instrument considerably more adaptable than the more traditional phalanx formations still favored by many of its Mediterranean rivals. And it would be tested against its most formidable opponent yet in the war that followed. It is at this point that Rome's story stops being a purely regional one and begins to intersect with the wider Mediterranean world, and specifically with Carthage, a powerful maritime city on the coast of North Africa, in what is now Tunisia. Carthage had grown extraordinarily wealthy through seaborne trade, controlling much of the commerce of the Western Mediterranean through a network of colonies and trading posts stretching from North Africa to Spain, Sardinia, and part of Sicily. Rome, having just completed the long process of unifying Italy, found itself increasingly drawn into the affairs of Sicily, an island close enough to the Italian mainland to matter strategically, but long dominated by a mix of Greek cities and Carthaginian outposts. In 264 BCE, a local dispute over the Sicilian city of Messina escalated through a chain of alliances and counter-alliances into open war between Rome and Carthage, the first of 3 conflicts spread across more than a century that historians collectively call the Punic Wars, from the Latin word punicus, meaning Carthaginian. By the time this first war began, Rome had already spent centuries learning how to absorb defeat, rebuild, and endure. And that capacity for endurance was about to be tested on a scale it had never faced before, against an enemy whose wealth, whose navy, and whose eventual champion would push the young republic closer to destruction than almost anything else in its long history. The First Punic War, which began in 264 BCE, lasted 23 years and was fought primarily at sea, a domain in which Rome had almost no prior experience whatsoever. The Romans were, by temperament and by tradition, a land power. Their military strength lay in disciplined infantry, in the legion, and in the citizen army accustomed to marching across Italian terrain rather than navigating open water. Carthage, by contrast, had built its wealth and its power on maritime trade for centuries, and its navy was, at the outset of the war, simply superior in every practical respect. According to later Roman accounts, the Republic built its first substantial war fleet by studying and reverse engineering a captured Carthaginian vessel that had run aground, a story that likely simplifies a more gradual process of naval development, but which captures something genuinely true about Roman behavior during this period. A fundamentally land-based power taught itself naval warfare essentially from scratch, under the pressure of wartime necessity, suffered catastrophic losses. Sometimes tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers drowned in a single storm, and simply kept building new fleets regardless. This willingness to absorb repeated, staggering losses without abandoning the effort would become one of the defining features of Roman warfare for the rest of the Republic's history. And it is difficult to overstate how unusual this persistence was by the standards of the ancient world, where most states, having suffered comparable losses, would have sued for peace long before Rome ever considered doing so. The war ended in 241 BCE with a hard-won Roman naval victory, and Carthage was forced to cede its territory in Sicily, which became Rome's first province outside the Italian mainland. Governed not through the incorporation and alliance system that had worked so well within Italy itself, but through direct administration by a Roman magistrate, a pattern that would become increasingly common as Rome's territorial holdings expanded beyond a scale that alliance alone could manage. The peace that followed did not last, in part because it was an uneasy peace to begin with, and in part because Carthage, seeking to recover from its losses and rebuild its economic base, expanded its territorial holdings in Spain, a region rich in silver mines and manpower. It was in Spain that a young Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca rose to prominence. The son of a commander who had fought against Rome in the First War and who was said to have made his young son swear an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome. Whether or not that particular story is strictly accurate, Hannibal is remembered, with very good reason, as one of the most capable military commanders in the history of warfare, and the conflict he initiated in 218 BCE, the Second Punic War, remains one of the most closely studied campaigns in military history to this day. Rather than attempt an invasion of Italy by sea, where Roman naval strength, rebuilt and strengthened since the First War, remained formidable, Hannibal chose an audacious alternative. He marched an army that included war elephants overland from Spain, across the Pyrenees Mountains, through southern Gaul, and over the Alps into northern Italy, a journey that cost him a substantial portion of his force to bitter cold, treacherous terrain, and the hostility of mountain tribes along the route, but which achieved something Rome had never anticipated and could barely believe when reports of it arrived: a Carthaginian army appearing not from the sea, where Roman defenses were prepared, but descending from the mountains at Rome's northern back door. Over the following years, Hannibal inflicted a series of devastating defeats on the armies Rome sent against him. The following year, at the town of Cannae in southern Italy, he achieved what military historians still regard as one of the most tactically perfect victories ever executed, deliberately allowing his center to bow inward under Roman pressure, while his flanks and cavalry swept around to encircle the entire Roman force from behind. What followed was less a battle than a methodical slaughter, with a Roman army numbering perhaps 50,000 men annihilated in a single day. One of the costliest single-day defeats any army has ever suffered. What happened next is, in some respects, more instructive than the battle itself, and it says a great deal about the resilience the Republic had spent 2 centuries building into its own institutions. Rome did not surrender, and it did not sue for peace. Despite losing, across these campaigns, a significant fraction of its entire adult male citizen population, despite Hannibal remaining on Italian soil, undefeated in open battle for well over a decade, the Roman state simply refused to negotiate. It raised new armies, drafting men who under normal circumstances would never have been called to serve, including, in the desperate years immediately after Cannae, slaves who were freed specifically so they could be enrolled as soldiers. It adopted a new and more cautious strategy under the general Fabius Maximus, avoiding direct pitched battle with Hannibal himself while wearing down his position through smaller engagements and by cutting off his supply lines, a strategy that was deeply unpopular at first, since it seemed to lack the decisive glory Romans traditionally prized in warfare, but which proved, in time, to be exactly what the situation required. This capacity to absorb catastrophic losses and immediately begin rebuilding, without the kind of political collapse or popular uprising that might have ended the war on Hannibal's terms, was a direct product of the resilient institutions forged during the long internal struggle between patricians and plebeians. A state whose citizens had learned, over generations, that grievances could be addressed through negotiation and gradual reform rather than through revolution, proved to be a state that could endure extraordinary external pressure without breaking apart from within. Eventually, a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had studied Hannibal's tactics closely and had proven himself in earlier campaigns in Spain, took the fight directly to Carthaginian territory in North Africa, a bold decision that forced Hannibal to abandon his position in Italy and return home to defend his own city. The two commanders finally met in direct battle at Zama, near Carthage itself, in 2002 BCE, and Scipio, using cavalry tactics adapted in part from what he had learned fighting against Hannibal's own methods, won a decisive victory. Carthage was stripped of its overseas territories, its war fleet, and its independent ability to wage war without Roman permission, reduced from a great Mediterranean power to a diminished and closely watched client state. A third and final Punic War followed decades later, provoked in large part by a faction within the Roman Senate, led most famously by the elder statesman Cato, who reportedly ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of its subject, with the phrase that Carthage must be destroyed, convinced that the city's mere continued existence, even in its weakened state, represented an unacceptable long-term threat. This third war, fought between 49 and 46 BCE, ended not merely in Carthage's defeat, but in its complete physical destruction. Its population killed or sold into slavery, its territory annexed outright as a Roman province, a conclusion far more total and far more brutal than the outcomes of either of the previous two conflicts, and one that later Roman writers themselves would sometimes reflect on with a degree of unease. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome controlled the entire Western Mediterranean outright and had already begun extending its influence eastward as well, largely through a combination of military intervention and diplomatic entanglement with the various kingdoms that had emerged from the fractured empire of Alexander the Great more than a century earlier. Macedonia, once the seat of Alexander's own power, was conquered and eventually annexed as a Roman province. The Seleucid kingdom in the east was decisively defeated and forced into a humiliating peace. Greek cities, admired by educated Romans for their philosophy, their art, and their literature, even as Rome subordinated them politically, came increasingly under Roman oversight. Rome had become, within the span of little more than a century, the dominant power of the entire Mediterranean world, a transformation of almost bewildering speed. And this transformation brought with it a set of problems that the old republican institutions, designed originally for the modest scale of a single city-state, were not well equipped to handle. Wealth flowed into Rome from these newly conquered territories in genuinely enormous quantities. Grain from Sicily and North Africa to feed a rapidly growing urban population. Precious metals extracted from the mines of Spain. Slaves captured by the tens of thousands during successful campaigns, who were put to work on farms, in households, and in mines across Italy, and formal tribute paid by subject peoples and provinces, flowing steadily into the Roman treasury and into the private fortunes of the generals and governors who oversaw these territories. This new wealth, however, was distributed with striking unevenness. Wealthy senators and a rising class of prosperous businessmen known as equestrians used their access to capital, to slave labor, and to political influence to acquire vast agricultural estates, known as latifundia, displacing the small independent farmers who had traditionally formed both the economic and the military backbone of the Republic, since military service in this period remained tied to a certain minimum level of property ownership. As these small farmers lost their land, unable to compete with slave-worked estates producing at a scale and a cost they could not match, many drifted toward Rome itself, swelling the ranks of an urban poor population with no meaningful stake in the traditional agricultural economy, and, in a development with serious long-term consequences, increasingly no stake in the traditional citizen army system either, since men without property could no longer meet the requirements for legionary service. This growing and increasingly visible inequality, combined with an aristocracy that had grown thoroughly accustomed to the enormous personal fortunes now available through provincial governorship, tax collection, and successful military command, set the stage for roughly a century of escalating political tension and, eventually, outright violence, tension that would ultimately consume and destroy the very republican institutions that had made Rome's remarkable rise possible in the first place. The Rome that had endured Hannibal at its gates without collapsing from within was about to face a very different kind of threat, one that would not come from a foreign general crossing the Alps, but from ambitious men within its own walls. The first serious rupture in this long-building tension came with two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, plebeian aristocrats descended from a genuinely distinguished family, who, during the 130s and 130s BCE, attempted to address the growing land crisis directly. Tiberius, elected as a tribune of the people in 93 BCE, proposed that public land, which had technically belonged to the Roman state for generations, but which had been informally seized, enclosed, and monopolized by wealthy families well beyond the legal limits originally set for such holdings, should be redistributed in modest allotments to landless and impoverished citizens. This was not, in itself, a particularly radical idea by the standards of earlier Roman history. Similar redistribution schemes had been proposed and occasionally implemented before. But by the late 2nd century BCE, the wealthy families who now held this land had grown far more powerful, far more organized, and far less willing to accept any reduction in their holdings than their predecessors had been. Tiberius's proposal proved popular with the poor, who saw in it a genuine chance to reclaim some measure of economic independence, and it proved bitterly, furiously unpopular with much of the senatorial elite, who saw it as a dangerous precedent. And, in Tiberius's methods of pushing the measure through over the objections of a fellow tribune, a troubling disregard for established political norms. The dispute escalated rapidly, and in 133 BCE, a group of senators and their supporters, acting essentially as a mob rather than through any formal legal process, beat Tiberius to death along with several hundred of his followers. His younger brother Gaius, elected tribune himself a decade later, pursued a broader and more ambitious program of reform, including further land redistribution, subsidized grain for the urban poor, and an extension of certain rights to Rome's Italian allies, and he too was ultimately killed in 21 BCE, along with thousands of his supporters, after the Senate passed an emergency decree authorizing the sitting consul to use whatever force he deemed necessary to protect the state. The killing of the Gracchi brothers, separated by little more than a decade, established a precedent that would prove almost impossible to reverse in the century that followed. That political disputes in Rome, however contentious, could now be settled through organized violence rather than exclusively through the ordinary mechanisms of law, debate, and popular assembly that had governed Roman political life, however imperfectly, for hundreds of years. Once that boundary had been crossed and crossed again without lasting consequence for those responsible, it did not remain a boundary for long. Over the following decades, this pattern hardened considerably. The general Gaius Marius, elected consul and unprecedented 7 times across his career, reorganized the Roman army in the final years of the 2nd century BCE, opening recruitment to landless citizens who owned no property at all. A practical and, in the short term, quite successful reform that solved an urgent and immediate manpower shortage. The traditional property-based system could no longer meet. But this reform carried a profound and largely unintended consequence. Soldiers recruited in this new way, no longer property owners with an independent economic stake in Roman society, became substantially dependent on their commanding general for their pay during service and, just as importantly, for the promise of land upon eventual retirement. Since the Roman state itself provided no reliable pension system of its own, this transformed the fundamental loyalty of the Roman legions in a way that would echo through the rest of Roman history. Where soldiers had once served the Roman state as citizens fulfilling a civic obligation, they increasingly came to serve, in practice if not always in formal theory, the particular general who could realistically guarantee their future welfare. This shift placed an extraordinary and dangerously personal degree of military power in the hands of any sufficiently ambitious and sufficiently successful individual commander. This new and volatile dynamic played out with brutal clarity in the rivalry between Marius and his former subordinate, a nobleman named Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a rivalry that culminated in 88 BCE in Sulla marching his own legions directly on the city of Rome itself. an act with no real precedent in Roman history, and one that shocked contemporaries even amid the growing violence of the era. Sulla would later be appointed dictator, an office that had traditionally existed only to handle brief, clearly defined emergencies with a strict time limit, but which Sulla used instead to conduct a systematic and calculated purge of his political enemies, publishing what were called proscription lists, naming men who could be killed on sight without any trial, their property immediately confiscated by the state, or more precisely, by Sulla's own supporters. Sulla eventually retired from public life voluntarily in 79 BCE, restoring a version of traditional republican government and constitutional practice. But the precedent he had set, that a general commanding an army personally loyal to him could seize the capital by force and reshape its laws entirely according to his own will, could not be quietly set aside. It had entered the realm of the politically possible. And in Roman politics, what has once proven possible tends, sooner or later, to be attempted again. The final decades of the Republic were dominated by a rotating cast of increasingly powerful individuals whose accumulated personal military and political authority came to dwarf the collective authority of the Senate as a governing institution. Pompey, later given the honorific title Pompey the Great, built an extraordinary military reputation through a series of successful campaigns across the eastern Mediterranean, clearing the seas of piracy and reorganizing entire kingdoms according to Roman interests. Marcus Licinius Crassus accumulated one of the largest private fortunes in Roman history, reportedly through a combination of shrewd and, by later account, rather ruthless real estate dealings in the city of Rome itself, and won further prestige by crushing the large-scale slave rebellion led by the gladiator Spartacus in 71 BCE. And Gaius Julius Caesar, an ambitious patrician of considerable political skill, personal charisma, and, as events would soon demonstrate, quite exceptional military talent, spent much of the 50s BCE conducting a lengthy campaign of conquest in Gaul, corresponding roughly to modern France and Belgium. A campaign that both enormously expanded Roman territory and, just as significantly, gave Caesar a large, battle-hardened, and fiercely personally loyal army. This Gallic campaign, which Caesar later described in his own detailed written account, the Commentaries on the Gallic War, unfolded over roughly 8 years and against a shifting coalition of Gallic tribes whose internal rivalries Caesar exploited with considerable skill. Early victories against the Helvetii, a tribe attempting a mass migration through Roman allied territory, and against a Germanic warband under a chieftain named Ariovistus, secured Caesar's initial foothold and established his reputation for decisive action. In 55 and 54 BCE, seeking further prestige and pushing the boundaries of what many in Rome considered the edge of the known world, Caesar led 2 expeditions across the English Channel into Britain, campaigns that achieved more in terms of reputation than territory, since neither resulted in lasting Roman occupation of the island, but which caused a sensation back in Rome, where an army marching onto a distant and half-legendary island seemed to confirm Caesar's extraordinary ambition. The most difficult test of the entire campaign came in 52 BCE, when a large-scale revolt broke out across Gaul under a young and capable leader named Vercingetorix, who succeeded, for a time, in uniting normally quarrelsome Gallic tribes into a single coordinated resistance. The decisive confrontation came at the hill fortress of Alesia, where Caesar's legions, though considerably outnumbered by both the besieged defenders and a large Gallic relief force arriving from outside, constructed an extraordinary double ring of fortifications, one facing inward to contain Vercingetorix's army within the fortress, and one facing outward to hold off the relief force, and successfully held both lines simultaneously until the relief force was broken and Vercingetorix was forced to surrender. This victory effectively ended organized Gallic resistance and completed Rome's conquest of the entire region at a human cost that Caesar's own accounts, along with later estimates by historians, suggest was extraordinarily heavy for the Gallic population, with a substantial portion killed, enslaved, or displaced over the course of the war. In 60 BCE, these three men, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, formed an informal political alliance that historians have since termed the First Triumvirate, pooling their considerable individual influence to dominate Roman politics over the increasingly powerless objections of the traditional senatorial establishment. This arrangement held together, not without friction, for roughly a decade, but it was inherently unstable, built as it was on personal ambition and mutual convenience rather than any shared political principle. Crassus was killed in 53 BCE during a disastrous and poorly planned military campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east, removing one leg of the arrangement entirely and leaving Caesar and Pompey as the two remaining and increasingly rival centers of power. Relations between the two men deteriorated steadily as the Senate, growing genuinely alarmed by the scale of Caesar's military success and the depth of his soldiers' personal loyalty to him, aligned itself more and more firmly with Pompey, and in 49 BCE, formally ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as an ordinary private citizen, stripped of his military command. Caesar's response to this order has become one of the most famous moments in Western history. Rather than comply, he led a single legion across the Rubicon, a small and, in ordinary circumstances, entirely unremarkable river marking the formal boundary of the province he had been governing, with his soldiers still under arms, an unambiguous act of rebellion against the Roman state, and one that has since become a byword across many languages and many centuries, for irrevocably passing a point of no return. The civil war that followed lasted several years and ranged across an enormous geographic span, through Italy, Greece, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain, before ending in decisive victory for Caesar. Pompey, defeated in battle, fled to Egypt seeking refuge, only to be assassinated on the orders of the Egyptian royal court, who hoped, mistakenly as it turned out, that presenting his head to Caesar would curry favor with the war's ultimate victor. Caesar, now the unrivaled master of the entire Roman world, was appointed dictator, first for a limited term, and eventually for life, an unprecedented grant of permanent personal authority. He used this extraordinary position to implement a range of significant reforms, extending Roman citizenship more broadly across Italy and even into some provinces, undertaking major public building projects in Rome, and restructuring the calendar in a way that, with later refinements, remains recognizably the basis of the calendar still used across much of the world today. Caesar's dominance, however, proved strikingly short-lived. A group of senators, numbering perhaps 60 in total, and including several men who had once counted themselves among his political allies and personal friends, came to believe that his continued accumulation of personal power represented an intolerable and existential threat to the Republic, and to the political traditions their ancestors had spent centuries building. On the 15th of March, 44 BCE, a date remembered by its Roman designation as the Ides of March, these conspirators assassinated Caesar in a meeting of the Senate itself, stabbing him more than 20 times as he attempted, according to later accounts, to shield himself with his own toga. The conspirators appear to have genuinely believed that removing Caesar would restore the old republican order they remembered, or imagined they remembered, from an earlier and less turbulent era. Instead, Caesar's death triggered yet another round of civil war, this time fought primarily between Caesar's chosen heir, his young grandnephew, and adopted son Octavian, barely 19 years old at the time of the assassination, and Caesar's former lieutenant and close ally Mark Antony, who had subsequently allied himself, both politically and personally, with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, and one of the most capable rulers of her era. This lengthy and complicated conflict culminated in the naval Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, off the western coast of Greece, where Octavian's forces, commanded in the field by his skilled general Marcus Agrippa, decisively defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra, both of whom subsequently took their own lives rather than face capture and the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as conquered enemies. Octavian returned to Rome as its unchallenged and undisputed master, having outlasted every serious rival across nearly 2 decades of intermittent civil war. And what he chose to do next would shape the following 4.5 centuries of Roman history, and indeed, a very great deal of world history beyond it. Rather than declaring himself king outright, a title the Romans still viscerally associated with the tyranny they believed, whether entirely accurately or not, they had thrown off 500 years earlier when they expelled their last king. Octavian instead undertook the careful, patient construction of an entirely new political arrangement, one that preserved the outward forms and rhetoric of the Republic, while quietly concentrating real, effective power in his own hands alone. In 27 BCE, in a carefully staged and choreographed public gesture, he formally announced that he was returning full authority to the Senate and the Roman people. In response, the Senate, playing its assigned role in this arrangement, granted him a new honorific name, Augustus, meaning something like the revered one or the majestic one, along with a carefully assembled collection of powers, titles, and privileges that, taken together, made him the effective ruler of the entire Roman world. Even as everyone involved maintained the convenient public fiction that the Republic itself continued to exist unchanged. This moment, in 27 BCE, is generally regarded by historians as marking the beginning of the Roman Empire, and Augustus is considered, by convention, if not by his own chosen title, to be its first emperor, even though he himself carefully avoided that word throughout his life, preferring instead the far more modest and politically palatable title of princeps, meaning roughly first citizen. The long, violent, and often tragic century that had begun with the deaths of the Gracchi brothers had finally, exhaustively run its course, and out of its wreckage had emerged something genuinely new, a system that would go on to govern the Mediterranean world in one form or another for the better part of the next 5 centuries. The genius of Augustus's political settlement, and the reason it succeeded so thoroughly, where the more naked ambitions of Caesar, Sulla, and others before them had ultimately failed or provoked violent backlash, lay above all in its patience and its careful indirection. Augustus held genuine, substantial power through a deliberately assembled combination of formal offices and informal influence, including permanent personal command over most of the frontier provinces where the majority of Rome's legions were stationed. A position that gave him direct control over the army without requiring him to hold any single office that looked overtly monarchical. Yet he remained conspicuously careful to preserve the Senate's traditional dignity and privileges, to consult that body regularly on matters of state, and to avoid, at almost every turn, the outward appearance of monarchy, even as he exercised something functionally very close to it. He ruled for over 4 decades, from 27 BCE until his death in 14 CE. And during that long span, he brought a genuine and much-needed end to the nearly constant civil warfare that had plagued the last century of the Republic's existence. He reorganized the sprawling and often unwieldy Roman military into a smaller, more professional, and far more centrally controlled standing force. He reformed the tax system across the provinces to make revenue collection more predictable and considerably less prone to the kind of abusive extraction that had characterized much of the late Republican period. He initiated an extensive building program in the city of Rome itself, famously claiming, according to the historian Suetonius, that he had found a city built of brick and left it built of marble. And he established, gradually and with considerable care, a workable system for the orderly transfer of imperial power to a chosen successor, eventually settling, after the premature deaths of several intended heirs, on his stepson Tiberius. The period that followed Augustus's death is often referred to by historians as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, a span of very roughly 2 centuries during which, despite periodic wars fought along the empire's outer frontiers and occasional serious political upheaval at its very center, the core of the empire enjoyed a genuinely remarkable degree of internal stability, economic integration, and legal uniformity. Remarkable, at least, by the general standards of the ancient world. This does not mean the period passed without turmoil of its own. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that followed Augustus, comprising the emperors Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero in succession, produced rulers of strikingly varying competence, temperament, and, in at least 2 well-documented cases, apparent psychological instability. Caligula, according to later Roman sources writing well after his death, descended over the course of his brief reign into increasingly erratic, cruel, and financially reckless behavior, and was ultimately assassinated by officers of his own Praetorian Guard in 41 CE. Nero, whose troubled reign ended in 68 CE, was accused by his contemporary and later critics of extravagant personal spending, of persecuting the small but growing Christian community in Rome following a catastrophic fire that devastated much of the city in 64 CE, and he ultimately lost the crucial support of both the army and the Senate, taking his own life as soldiers arrived to arrest him on charges of treason against the state he nominally ruled. It is worth noting, in fairness to the historical record, that a great many of the more lurid and sensational stories told about emperors like Caligula and Nero come down to us from historians writing considerably after their deaths, often with clear political motives of their own for blackening the reputations of a fallen dynasty. And modern historians generally treat the most extreme individual claims with appropriate scholarly caution, while still recognizing that these particular reigns were, by the great majority of surviving accounts, genuinely troubled ones. Nero's death without any clear or agreed heir triggered a brief but genuinely intense civil war in 69 CE, a single chaotic year in which 4 different men claimed the imperial title in rapid and often bloody succession, a period historians remember with a certain grim economy of language as the year of the 4 emperors. Stability was eventually restored by Vespasian, an experienced general who had been leading Roman forces in a difficult and protracted war against a major Jewish revolt in the province of Judea, and who went on to found an entirely new imperial dynasty, the Flavians. Vespasian and his 2 sons and eventual successors, Titus and Domitian, oversaw a considerable amount of new construction in Rome, most famously beginning and later completing the Flavian Amphitheatre, far better known today by its later nickname, the Colosseum. A vast and architecturally sophisticated arena built specifically to host gladiatorial combat, staged animal hunts, and other public spectacles, and capable of seating tens of thousands of spectators drawn from every level of Roman society. The century that followed, spanning roughly from 96 to 100 CEE, is often regarded by historians, including the influential 18th century scholar Edward Gibbon, as the period during which the Roman Empire was governed most consistently well. Under a sequence of 5 successive rulers, sometimes grouped together as the 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. A particularly notable feature of this remarkable run of succession is that, with one significant exception at its very end, each of these emperors chose to adopt a capable and already experienced administrator as his intended successor, rather than relying purely on the accident of biological descent, a deliberate practice that, for a time at least, produced an unusually consistent run of genuinely competent leadership. Under Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117 CE, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent ever, stretching from the province of Britain in the northwest all the way to Mesopotamia in the east, and from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north down to the deserts of North Africa in the south. An almost unimaginably vast area for any single ancient government to administer with the communication and transportation technology available at the time. By this point, the army that achieved these conquests looked considerably different from the citizen levies that had fought the Samnite Wars or even Hannibal centuries earlier. Augustus had transformed the legions into a standing professional force, roughly 28 legions at the start of his reign, each with an official strength of around 5,500 men, supported by an equal or greater number of auxiliary troops, non-citizen soldiers recruited from across the provinces, who served in specialized roles as cavalry, archers, and light infantry, and who were granted Roman citizenship upon completion of a lengthy term of service, typically 25 years. A policy that both provided the army with skills the citizen legions often lacked and steadily extended, a sense of investment in Roman success to provincial populations across the empire. Trajan's most significant military achievement, the conquest of Dacia, a wealthy kingdom north of the Danube corresponding roughly to modern Romania, was fought across 2 hard campaigns in 101 to 102 and again in 105 to 106 CE, against a capable Dacian king named Decebalus, who had inflicted a notable defeat on an earlier Roman expedition under Domitian. Trajan's forces, employing extensive engineering work, including a massive permanent bridge across the Danube designed by his chief engineer Apollodorus of Damascus, one of the largest bridges built anywhere in the ancient world, eventually overcame Dacian resistance. And the campaign's importance to Trajan personally is reflected in the great commemorative column still standing in Rome today, its surface carved with a continuous spiraling frieze depicting the campaign in remarkable narrative detail. From river crossings and fortification building to individual battles and the eventual Dacian surrender, Dacia's conquest brought substantial mineral wealth, particularly gold, into the Roman treasury, funding an extensive building program in Rome itself. Trajan's later campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east, beginning in 1114 CE, achieved dramatic early successes, including the capture of the Parthian capital itself, but proved far less durable, as widespread revolts broke out across the newly conquered eastern territories almost as soon as Trajan's main force had moved on. And Trajan died in 17 CE before the situation could be fully resolved, leaving his successor Hadrian to make the pragmatic decision to abandon these eastern conquests entirely and withdraw to more defensible and more sustainable frontiers. A decision that set the tone for the more consolidative approach to empire that would characterize Hadrian's own subsequent reign. Hadrian, his chosen successor, took a notably different and more cautious approach to governing this enormous territory, deliberately consolidating rather than continuing to expand it, most famously ordering the construction of a substantial fortified wall across the width of northern Britain to mark and defend the empire's northern frontier there, and touring the provinces of the empire extensively and in person over the course of his reign to oversee their administration directly, rather than governing solely through distant correspondence. Marcus Aurelius, the last of these 5 celebrated rulers, is remembered today in 2 quite different capacities as a capable, if often beleaguered, military commander, who spent a considerable portion of his reign personally defending the empire's northern frontiers against persistent and increasingly serious incursions by various Germanic peoples, and as a philosopher of genuine depth and sincerity, whose private reflections on duty, mortality, and the demanding tenets of Stoic philosophy, composed largely during long military campaigns and never intended for publication, survive today as the Meditations, offering modern readers a rare and remarkably intimate glimpse into the inner life of a Roman ruler. Beyond the political and military history of this long peaceful period, it is worth pausing to consider what daily life actually looked like across the empire during these 2 relatively stable centuries. Because the Pax Romana was experienced by ordinary people not primarily through the actions of distant emperors, but through the steady, largely unglamorous infrastructure of an integrated Mediterranean economy. Roman roads, engineered with remarkable precision and built to standards that would not be widely matched again in Europe for well over 1,000 years, connected the empire's provinces in a network stretching, in total, tens of thousands of miles, allowing goods, information, and armies to move with a speed and reliability that no earlier Mediterranean power had ever achieved. Aqueducts, similarly engineered with great precision, carried fresh water across considerable distances into cities that, in some cases, housed populations not matched again in Europe until the modern era. A common currency, common weights and measures, and a broadly common legal framework meant that a merchant could conduct business across enormous distances, from Britain to Syria, with a reasonable and often justified expectation of consistent treatment. This is not to suggest that life across the empire was uniformly comfortable or fair. Slavery remained deeply embedded in the Roman economy and touched, in one way or another, a very large proportion of the empire's total population, and enormous disparities of wealth and legal status persisted between Roman citizens, provincial subjects, and the enslaved. But for a very substantial number of people living within its borders during this period, the Roman Empire delivered something genuinely rare in the ancient world: a long stretch of relative predictability, in which trade routes remained largely open, harvests could generally reach their intended markets, and the immediate threat of war, for those living well within the empire's borders rather than along its contested frontiers, receded into the background of ordinary life for one generation after another. To understand this daily texture more closely, it helps to walk, in the mind, through an ordinary day in a Roman city during this period. Whether in Rome itself or in one of the hundreds of smaller cities scattered across the provinces that had, by the 2nd century, come to resemble it in miniature. Most ordinary residents of Rome did not live in the grand marble houses called domus that survive today in fragments and in the better preserved ruins of cities like Pompeii. Those single-family homes, built around a central courtyard and often decorated with painted walls and mosaic floors, belonged to a comparatively small and wealthy minority. The great majority of the urban population lived instead in multi-story apartment blocks called insulae, densely packed structures that could rise 5 or 6 stories above the street, with shops and workshops occupying the ground floor and increasingly cramped, increasingly flammable living quarters stacked above. These buildings were, by most surviving accounts, genuinely difficult places to live. Fire was a constant and serious danger, since the upper floors were often built quickly and cheaply out of wood, and a fire brigade, organized under Augustus specifically to address this hazard, patrolled the city day and night with buckets, hooks, and a kind of early pump. Though their efforts could not always keep pace with the density of the buildings they were meant to protect. Water did not reach the upper floors of most insulae at all, which meant that residents on higher levels carried their own water up from public fountains fed by the aqueducts and disposed of waste, often carelessly, into the street below, a practice that made walking beneath the upper floors of a crowded street its own minor hazard. The rhythm of an ordinary day began early, generally at first light, since artificial lighting, whether by oil lamp or candle, was expensive enough that most households used it sparingly. A simple breakfast, if eaten at all, might consist of bread, sometimes dipped in wine, along with cheese or dried fruit if the household could afford it. The main meal of the day for most working Romans came in the evening, after work had concluded, and for the poorer residents of the city, that meal often depended heavily on a public grain distribution, a policy first formalized during the late Republic and continued and expanded under the emperors, which provided free or heavily subsidized grain to a significant portion of the city's population. A recognition, born partly out of genuine concern and partly out of hard political calculation, that a hungry and idle urban population posed a serious risk to public order. Beyond bread, the ordinary Roman diet relied heavily on olive oil, wine diluted with water, and a fermented fish sauce called garum, used across the empire much the way salt or soy sauce might be used today, to season vegetables, legumes, and, for those who could afford it, modest portions of meat or fish. Diets varied considerably by wealth and by region. but the underlying staples, grain, oil, and wine, remained remarkably consistent across the Mediterranean world, forming what modern historians sometimes call the Mediterranean Triad, a dietary pattern that had already been in place for centuries before Rome's rise and that would persist for centuries after its fall. Work occupied most of the daylight hours for the majority of the population. Rome's economy was built on an enormous range of skilled and unskilled trades. Bakers, who operated the large communal ovens whose remains can still be seen in cities like Pompeii. Fullers, who cleaned and treated woolen cloth using a process that involved, among other things, stale urine collected from public receptacles. A detail that surprises many people encountering it for the first time, but which reflects a genuinely practical use of available materials: blacksmiths and bronze workers, carpenters and stonemasons, whose skills were in constant demand given the scale of Roman public building, and a vast number of shopkeepers selling everything from pottery to preserved food to small household goods, often out of a single narrow room facing directly onto the street, with the family living in a mezzanine loft or a room behind the shop itself. Slavery touched nearly every level of this economic life. Enslaved people worked not only in the agricultural estates and mines discussed earlier, where conditions were often severe, but also as household servants, tutors, scribes, accountants, and skilled craftsmen within the city itself, where their treatment and their prospects varied enormously depending on the household and the specific role they filled. A slave working as an educated secretary in a wealthy household might live a materially comfortable life and could, under Roman law, eventually be freed by their owner, becoming a freed person with a genuine, if still socially limited, path towards citizenship for their own children. A slave working in a mine or on a large rural estate faced a far harsher and often considerably shorter life. This coexistence of relative opportunity for some enslaved individuals alongside brutal exploitation of others is one of the more difficult aspects of Roman society to summarize simply, and it resists any single tidy generalization. The Roman household itself, the familia, was organized around a legal and social structure that placed considerable formal authority in the hands of the eldest living male, the paterfamilias, who held, at least in principle, extensive legal power over his wife, his children, and any enslaved members of the household. In practice, the degree to which this formal authority was exercised varied enormously from household to household and shifted gradually over the centuries, with women in wealthier families in particular, gaining, over time, greater practical control over property and household affairs than the strict letter of earlier law might suggest. And Roman women, unlike their counterparts in classical Athens, could and often did own property, run businesses, and appear as active participants in the economic and social life of their communities, even though they remained excluded from formal political office and from voting in the popular assemblies. Children of wealthier families received an education that began at home and, for boys especially, often continued under the instruction of a hired tutor or at a small private school, progressing through reading, writing, and arithmetic before moving, for those destined for public life, into the study of rhetoric and oratory, skills considered essential for anyone hoping to participate meaningfully in law, politics, or public administration. Girls from wealthy families received a comparable basic education in many cases, though it rarely extended into the advanced training in rhetoric reserved for boys preparing for a public career. religion saturated daily life in a way that can be difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point, precisely because it was rarely separated out as a distinct category of experience, the way religious practice often is today. Each household maintained a small shrine, the lararium dedicated to its household gods, the lares and penates, and the head of the household performed small daily offerings, a bit of food or wine set aside before the family's own meal, as a matter of routine domestic practice rather than special occasion. The public calendar was dense with religious festivals, some solemn, some genuinely festive, marking the turning of the agricultural year, the founding of the city, and the honoring of the many gods who were understood to oversee every aspect of both public and private life. From the harvest to childbirth to the safe return of a fleet from sea. Bathing, too, played a role that extended well beyond simple hygiene into the realm of daily social life. The great public bathhouses found in Rome and in provincial cities alike were vast complexes offering hot, warm, and cold bathing rooms, exercise areas, libraries in some of the larger examples, and spaces simply to meet friends, conduct business, and exchange news. Open to a broad cross-section of urban society for a genuinely modest entrance fee, making them one of the more socially inclusive spaces in an otherwise sharply stratified world. Entertainment beyond the well-known spectacle of gladiatorial combat filled a considerable portion of the Roman public calendar as well. Chariot racing held an enormous purpose. Built venues like the Circus Maximus in Rome, which could hold well over 100,000 spectators at a time, commanded a passionate and often fiercely partisan following organized around teams distinguished by racing colors: red, white, blue, and green, with supporters following their chosen team with the kind of intense loyalty that might be recognizable to any modern follower of organized sport. Theatrical performances, ranging from broad comedy to more serious drama adapted from Greek originals, were performed in open-air theatres found in cities across the empire, many of which survive today in remarkably good condition. And religious festivals themselves frequently combined solemn ritual observance with genuinely festive public celebration, processions, feasting, and public games, blurring in ordinary practice any sharp line between devotion and enjoyment. Taken together, these details of ordinary existence, the cramped apartment buildings and the grand public baths, the bread queues and the household shrines, the enslaved secretary and the enslaved miner, the roar of the racing crowd and the quiet daily offering before the family meal, form the actual lived texture beneath the political history of emperors and frontiers that more often survives in the written record. It was this dense, largely anonymous, and only partially recorded daily life, repeated across millions of individual households scattered from Britain to Syria, that the Pax Romana ultimately protected and sustained for as long as it did. And it is this daily life, more than any single battle or any single emperor's reign, that gives the period its most enduring claim to the description of a genuine peace. The relatively stable pattern of adoptive succession that had served the empire so well for nearly a century finally came to an end with Marcus Aurelius, who, breaking decisively from the practice of each of his four immediate predecessors, chose to be succeeded by his own biological son, Commodus, whose reign proved troubled from very early on, and whose eventual assassination in 122 CE plunged the empire once again into a fresh round of civil war. the dynasty that eventually emerged victorious from this renewed conflict, known as the Severans, held onto power through the early decades of the 3rd century. But the deeper structural pressures building beneath the surface of the empire, mounting financial strain caused by an increasingly large and increasingly expensive professional military, growing external threats along the frontiers from resurgent Germanic peoples to the north, and a newly aggressive Persian Empire to the east, and an imperial succession system that, whatever its occasional successes, still depended far too heavily on the personal loyalty of individual army units rather than any settled and reliable constitutional process, were steadily building toward a period of instability more severe than anything the empire had experienced since the last chaotic decades of the Republic itself. That instability arrived with genuinely overwhelming force during the middle decades of the 3rd century, a period historians now commonly call the crisis of the 3rd century, spanning roughly from 235 to 284 CE. During these 5 decades, the empire experienced an almost bewildering succession of emperors, more than 20 in total, most of whom came to power through direct military acclamation by their own troops and died violently within a few years or even a few months, whether at the hands of rival claimants, mutinous soldiers who had grown disillusioned or simply unpaid, or, in a comparatively small number of cases, foreign enemies encountered in battle. At its most fractured point, the empire briefly split into 3 entirely separate political entities operating simultaneously: a breakaway state controlling Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain, a breakaway kingdom centered on the wealthy trading city of Palmyra in the eastern desert, ruled for a time by the formidable Queen Zenobia, and the greatly diminished central Roman state itself, still nominally the successor to Augustus's empire, but controlling only a fraction of its former territory with any real confidence, before all 3 were eventually and forcibly reunified through hard, sustained military effort. Compounding this already severe political chaos, this same period also saw serious and widespread epidemic disease sweep across the Mediterranean world, an outbreak modern historians now generally call the Plague of Cyprian, striking at precisely the moment when the empire's military and administrative institutions were already stretched to their absolute limit. And this crisis was further compounded by currency debasement so severe and so sustained that the actual silver content of standard Roman coinage collapsed dramatically over the course of just a few decades, and persistent price inflation, largely unfamiliar to earlier generations of Romans, became a chronic and deeply corrosive feature of everyday economic life across the empire. The empire's eventual recovery from this extended crisis is generally credited to a sequence of tough, experienced soldier emperors, most significantly Aurelian, who reunified the 3 fractured territories through a series of rapid, decisive, and remarkably effective military campaigns in the early 270s, earning himself the title Restorer of the World, and Diocletian, who came to power in 284 CE and undertook what was, in scope and ambition, the single most sweeping reorganization of Roman government since the original settlement established by Augustus more than 3 centuries earlier. Diocletian recognized clearly, based on the hard experience of the previous 5 decades, that the empire by this point had simply grown too vast, and its many frontiers too extensive and too simultaneously threatened, for any single ruler, however capable, to govern and defend effectively from one central location. In 293 CE, he established a new administrative system historians now call the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four, dividing supreme imperial authority among four separate rulers at once: two senior emperors bearing the title Augustus, and two junior emperors bearing the title Caesar, each one responsible for defending and administering a clearly distinct region of the empire, with a carefully intended arrangement that each junior Caesar would eventually and peacefully succeed his corresponding senior Augustus, creating, at least on paper, an orderly and entirely planned mechanism for future transitions of power that had eluded Rome for the better part of 3 centuries. Alongside this structural reform, Diocletian also undertook extensive administrative and economic changes, thoroughly reorganizing provincial boundaries to make individual units of government smaller and more manageable, restructuring the empire's system of taxation to make revenue collection more predictable, and attempting, with only limited and temporary success, to bring runaway inflation under some measure of control through a formal imperial edict fixing maximum permissible prices for a very long list of goods and services across the entire empire. The tetrarchic system, however logically sound it may have appeared on paper, did not ultimately survive sustained contact with the same underlying forces of personal ambition that had destabilized Roman succession in one form or another for the better part of 3 centuries. Following Diocletian's own voluntary retirement in 305 CE, itself a remarkably rare event in the entire span of Roman history, a fresh round of civil wars broke out among a new generation of rival claimants to power. A conflict eventually won, after some years of hard fighting, by Constantine, the son of one of the original 4 tetrarchs, who by 324 CE had defeated his last remaining rival and reunified the entire empire once again under his own sole personal rule. Constantine's reign proved to be one of the most genuinely consequential in the whole of Roman history, though for reasons that had comparatively little to do with military conquest in the traditional sense. In 3013 CE, acting jointly with his eastern counterpart Licinius, he issued what is now known as the Edict of Milan, formally granting legal toleration to Christianity, a faith that had previously been subject to periodic and, on occasion, quite severe official persecution under a number of earlier emperors, stretching back to the reign of Nero himself. Constantine's own personal relationship to Christian belief remains a genuine subject of ongoing scholarly debate and discussion, but across the remainder of his reign, he increasingly and visibly favored the growing Christian church in matters of policy, patronage, and public building. Convened its very first major ecumenical council at Nicaea in 325 CE, specifically to resolve serious theological disputes that were threatening to divide the faith at a formative moment in its development, and was formally baptized shortly before his death in 337 CE. Within a matter of only a few further decades, under the later Emperor Theodosius toward the end of the 4th century, Christianity would move decisively from a merely tolerated minority religion within the empire to its official and exclusively established state religion. Constantine also made a further decision during his reign that carried enormous long-term geographic and political consequences of its own. He founded an entirely new imperial capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, chosen deliberately for its highly strategic position at the crossing point between Europe and Asia. Formally dedicating this new city in 330 CE and naming it with a degree of imperial modesty that has amused historians ever since, Constantinople after himself. This new eastern capital, positioned to oversee more directly the wealthy, populous, and economically vital provinces of the eastern Mediterranean, and to respond far more readily to the persistent and often serious military threat posed by the neighboring Persian Empire, gradually became at least as important to the practical functioning of the empire as the city of Rome itself, and in a good many respects, considerably more so. The 4th and 5th centuries saw the Roman Empire increasingly, and ultimately permanently, divided into two separate administrative halves, Western and Eastern. A division formally confirmed after the death of the Emperor Theodosius in 3095 CE, when his two surviving sons inherited the western and eastern portions of the empire as entirely separate realms. This growing administrative division reflected genuine and steadily widening differences between the two halves of what had once been a unified state. The Eastern Empire, centered securely on the well-fortified and highly defensible city of Constantinople, retained a dense network of prosperous cities, a robust and reliable tax base, and comparatively more defensible geographic frontiers. The Western Empire, by sharp contrast, faced steadily mounting and increasingly difficult pressure along its long Rhine and Danube frontiers from a genuinely complex mix of Germanic peoples, some of them actively seeking peaceful land and resettlement within Roman territory, others driven forcibly westward by the earlier expansion of the Huns. A nomadic confederation whose own westward migration in the late 4th century had set off a long chain reaction of displacement and pressure across a great deal of Central and Eastern Europe. The Western Empire's mounting difficulties compounded steadily over the decades that followed. In 410 CE, the Visigothic king Alaric led his forces into the city of Rome itself and thoroughly sacked it. An event that, while not especially decisive in narrow military terms, sent genuine shockwaves through the entire Roman world, precisely because Rome, though no longer the empire's practical administrative capital for well over a century by this point, remained an object of truly immense symbolic significance, a city that had not fallen to any foreign army in roughly 800 years of continuous history. Further serious pressures followed in the decades after. The Vandals crossed into North Africa and established an independent kingdom there by the 430s, depriving the Western Empire of one of its single most important sources of grain and reliable tax revenue at the worst possible moment. The Huns, under their now famous leader Attila, campaigned extensively and destructively across both the eastern and western halves of the empire during the 440s and into the early 450s, before Attila's own sudden death and the subsequent rapid collapse of the entire Hunnic confederation he had built, and various Germanic peoples, including the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, and the Franks, established increasingly autonomous and, in time, fully independent kingdoms across what had formerly been unified Roman territory in Gaul, Spain, and elsewhere in the West. By the middle years of the 5th century, the office of Western Roman Emperor had become, in practical terms, a largely symbolic one, with genuine military and political power concentrated instead in the hands of powerful generals, often themselves of Germanic origin despite serving nominally as loyal Roman officers, who effectively made and unmade emperors as it suited their own particular interests at any given moment. This long, gradual arrangement finally came to its quiet conclusion in 476 CE, when a Germanic military commander named Odoacer deposed the reigning Western emperor, a very young man bearing the almost poignantly ironic name Romulus, Augustulus, a name combining that of Rome's own legendary founder with a diminutive, almost affectionately dismissive form of the title, first properly borne by Augustus. Odoacer declined to appoint any further successor to the position, instead sending the imperial regalia east to Constantinople as a symbolic gesture, and ruled Italy thereafter in his own right as king. This event is conventionally cited by historians as marking the end of the Western Roman Empire, though most historians today understand it less as any single, sudden, dramatic collapse, and more as the final, almost quietly anticlimactic culmination of a long and gradual process of transformation that had already been steadily underway, in one form or another, for the better part of a century. It is worth pausing in closing to note carefully what did not end in 476 CE, the eastern half of the empire, which modern historians commonly refer to as the Byzantine Empire, though its own inhabitants continued to call themselves Romans without any sense of contradiction right up until its final fall, continued for nearly another full 1,000 years, governing from Constantinople, preserving Roman law, Roman administrative tradition, and a great deal of classical learning that might otherwise have been lost entirely, until the city finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. In the West, meanwhile, Roman institutions did not simply vanish overnight along with the last Western emperor. The Latin language persisted across the former Western provinces and gradually evolved over further centuries into the various Romance languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people across the world today. Roman law, especially as later carefully codified under the Eastern Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, would go on to shape the development of European legal systems for well over 1,000 years afterward. And Roman roads, Roman aqueducts, and Roman administrative boundaries continued, in many cases, to structure the physical landscape and the practical governance of medieval Europe long after the last Western emperor had been quietly and almost unceremoniously set aside by a general who saw little further use for the title. Looking back across this long arc, from a modest scattering of huts beside the Tiber to a legendary founding, through the long internal struggle between patricians and plebeians that produced Rome's distinctive and remarkably resilient republican institutions, through the grueling wars with Carthage that made Rome master of the entire Western Mediterranean, through the century of civil conflict that ultimately destroyed the Republic, even as it unintentionally laid the foundations for the empire that replaced it, through 2 centuries of relative peace, prosperity, and genuine integration, through crisis, sweeping reform, profound religious transformation, and eventual administrative division, what stands out most clearly is not any single cause or any single dramatic turning point, but rather the sheer duration and the remarkable adaptability of the entire enterprise. Very few political structures in the whole of recorded human history have shown the sustained capacity to repeatedly reinvent themselves under as much accumulated pressure as Rome did across more than 1,000 years, from monarchy to republic to empire, from a single unremarkable city-state to a Mediterranean-spanning power governing tens of millions of people, speaking dozens of different languages, and practicing a genuinely wide range of religious traditions, eventually including the one that would go on to shape so very much of the world that followed in its wake. The physical remains of that ancient world are still visible today, in the worn and weathered stones of the Roman Forum, in the great curved silhouette of the Colosseum standing quietly against the modern city that has grown up around it, in the long straight lines of roads that once carried legions and merchants alike across 3 separate continents, and in the aqueducts that once carried fresh water into cities whose populations, in more than one case, would not be matched again anywhere in Europe for well over 1,000 years afterward. But the more enduring legacy of Rome may, in the end, be considerably less visible than any of these physical remains. It lies instead in the underlying structure of legal systems built, whether their inhabitants realize it or not, on distinctly Roman foundations. It lies in calendars still organized to this day around a reform first undertaken by Julius Caesar more than 2,000 years ago. It lies in languages descended directly from Latin and spoken now by hundreds of millions of people scattered across every inhabited continent. And it lies in the enduring, endlessly studied, endlessly argued over example of a republic that rose from almost nothing, transformed itself gradually into an empire, endured for centuries longer than almost anyone at any point along the way might reasonably have expected, and eventually, slowly, unevenly, gave way to a different world entirely, without ever quite disappearing from it altogether. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.